Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Mastuma Vidvishavahai Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we work together with a great deal of energy. May our study be illumined. May we not unnecessarily cavil with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Banakti na frile bride, arive gua le. So blessings on all of you on this St. Brigid's Day. And that goes to all of you. So as I mentioned, it is St. Brigid's Day in 2023, that is next year. The government of the Republic of Ireland have decided to make this day a public holiday. So why would they do that? What is the significance of that? Well, it happens also to coincide with a festival, an ancient festival of Imbolc, which is that period of time between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. In other words, and it literally means something like milk of the ewe, or indicating a flow of nourishment that comes from the belly in the first moments of spring. There are many people in Ireland who don't really think it's spring. I'm one of those. It doesn't feel like it. And strictly speaking, I think in the ancient days it might well have been the 13th of February. But since there was a Saint Brigid who lived from 451 of this current era to 525, very early. And she died on 1st of February. And so the whole thing was coincided. This is a very rich fabric of weaving the ancient with the contemporary, without any antagonism to anybody. You see how the opening prayer, the peace prayer, gives us or invokes protection, nourishment, invokes strength. It also invokes peace. It invokes illumination. It invokes vigor. It invokes reason where emotions can run high. And this only comes when you integrate everything. For convenience, we can break the human body or the human person into various segments. The human body is one. The psychic, that is the psyche, that is the mind, is another. The intellect is another. Breath can be another. Energy can be another. And as long as man has existed, the question arises, how do I access this peace that passes all understanding? How do I reach an ideal of perfection that everybody has, even from ancient times? It strikes me that the very ancient, even pre-Celtic people were in tune with nature. They knew how to make specialized tools. They knew how to honor and love the land. They knew about the sun and its transition across the sky. They knew about the seasons. They were also concerned with issues of birth, life, and death. And the Celtic people adopted all of that and enriched it. And the Celtic traditions also will adopt the spirals of the ancient Neolithic periods, indicating something to do with the sun. So it's no surprise, therefore, that there were some ancient gods and goddesses representing various aspects of the manifested nature, that manifestation of the infinite reality that we call the world. What the eyes see, what the ears hear, what everything picks up, what we register, and what we separate normally from its source, the underlying current, the entity that wants to express itself. And it expresses itself in the agricultural seasons. It expresses itself in the sun, the rainfall. the earth. And the harmony between all of this is noted, and every effort is made to harmonize these things. Because we all want good fortune. And so there are some traditions from ancient times that have come to us at this season. Folk customs associated with the Celtic goddess Brigid. And there are many supernatural events and folk customs associated with her. And later comes the Saint Brigid of 450 to 525 or so. She dies at the age of about 72. And we can see many things in common. We can see many integrations of characteristics. We can see that the Irish myth associated with Brigid were to do with poetry, healing, protection, smithcraft, domestic animals. And furthermore, of course, the saint's feast day falls exactly on this traditional festival. It is not coincidental. It is a harmony seen in these various ways. At a time where the new religion of Christianity was making inroads into the island of Ireland without any shed of blood. Unlike many other regions in the Roman Empire, for example, where barbarians were conquered and war was made, Ireland is unique. The holy wells were honored in the ancient times. Today they are still honored. The symbols of the sun were carefully constructed and honored. One such symbol has come to us and been integrated as St. Brigid's cross. There's a story about that comes into the Christian variety of it. Brigid was called to the side of a chief who was dying, or at least in a very poor health condition. And he wasn't a believer necessarily in the deep Christian values that Brigid held. And so she saw some straw on the floor, and with that straw, she then wove a pattern as she was talking, and it turned out to be a cross. And she was talking about the deep mystical significance of this cross. And this has come to us as Brigid's cross. It so happens I have a newly made example of it, and here it is. What you'll notice is it's not a standard vertical and horizontal structure. And this is a very ancient system that really has come down to us from the Indo-Germanic world, the world which has provided us with links to the Indo-Aryan or Indo-Germanic language and culture. That is, if we look at the Gaelic language that is spoken here in Ireland, as well as in Scotland and Wales, and in Brittany, and in the Isle of Man also, there is a very close connection with this ancient Sanskrit. And that indicates that some cultural or cross-cultural influence must have been there. And so this Brigid's cross is, according to the ancient tradition, a symbol of whatever the swastika is a symbol of. Swastika, of course, got a bad name because the Nazi Germans took that and distorted it, made it black instead of red, and the whole symbolism was lost, became a symbol of oppression, became a symbol of greed and power. But this Brigid's cross and the swastika, in its origin, symbolizes the very opposite. It symbolizes prosperity from every direction being drawn inward. It symbolizes the sun. It symbolizes the four corners of stability. The earth has 4 directions. It symbolizes the harmony of all the seasons. Its central portion is something like a mosaic, carefully weaved. It is made from reeds, or sometimes it would be made from whatever else was available in the agricultural season. And it is a tradition on this day that every person weaves such a thing. And as they do so, they have the opportunity to make something like a mandala or a yantra, something like a diagram or something like a symbol, that if we can do it mindfully, will symbolize all these particular elements that are auspicious for us. But to integrate it now with everything, without disturbing anything, is the great, great art that has arrived in Ireland. And so all the characteristics of this pre-Christian deity were incorporated in the holy life of a servant girl. Historically, Brigid's mother was associated with a certain with her husband, and she was a servant girl, and they had the child who was Brigid, and it indicates by virtue of her name how there was this crossover between Christianity, her mother was Christian, and the pre-Christian tradition which is there, and a nice synthesis and blend of the two. Why else would she be called by that name? Now it so happened that the husband sold the wife into slavery again to somebody else, and so Brigid was brought up in slavery. There's one tradition that she was part of the servant duty of making butter and working in the dairy and so on and so forth, and a quota had to be given. And Brigid, by nature, was generous, had a great sensitivity for the poor. That spirituality was deep within her. And so she gave all the butter away. And now what to do about the quota? It would put the mother into trouble. So she prayed deeply, and the butter was all well replenished, and not only that, but exceeded the minimum quota that was required. So there was this remarkable saintliness issuing from pure love and generosity of spirit, setting an example for all of us. And that becomes, such a person becomes recognized as an ideal of perfection for all of us, a model to follow. That's why we study these lives. But the most remarkable thing was that as she grew in her generosity and spirit, with no thought for her personal safety, her father, she went back to her father at the age of 10, and he was at its wits' end with regards to her giving away everything to the poor. And so he took her to the King of Leinster out of desperation and said, this child is giving me a lot of problems. And even there, she saw his precious sword and gave that away because she saw a poor person, and she gave him the means to uplift himself materially. And that was the last straw. But the king, having heard the story, noted that this was such a noble deed, and that the rewards that were due to her would far exceed the value of the sword. And he gave a different turn to the events. It was, I think, the same king that Brigid appealed to, because she ultimately took up the life of a nun. And so she went to a famous saint of the time and got permission to lead a life of renunciation. And She became an abbess and she needed some land. She asked the king for a piece of land and he said, no, thank you. And so she thought about it, prayed about it, aligned her will to the divine. And she proposed, look, I tell you what, you can give me a piece of land that is the same extent of my cloak. And he laughed, of course, he readily agreed. And so her 4 sister nuns, she gave an instruction, please take each corner of this cloak and walk in 4 directions and keep walking. Miraculously, the cloak extended and extended to so far that it had completely covered the amount of land that she required. And the king had to keep his promise and request her, beg her, please, please stop stretching this. The land is yours. Now, she was a remarkable woman in the sense that we honor here at the Vedanta Society 2 key women in Ireland. One is, of course, Sister Nivedita, born in Dungannon. And she had a similar temperament. First of all, she wasn't shy to assert herself as a woman, following the dictates of her conscience. She was a revolutionary in her own way, but she was also a prolifically talented person. Talented writer, talented orator, talented educator, all of these things. Talented poet. The life of Swami Vivekananda, we hardly know anything about. People wanted to write his autobiography and nobody felt they could do justice to his life. And so it was Sister Nivedita who picked up the theme after his passing in a book called The Master as I Saw Him. She carefully wrote that and wrote the title because I'm not saying this is everything about him. Everybody is shy to give their account of his biography. I'm saying this is the Master as I'm seeing him. You may be seeing him differently, but this was my experience of him. And so this remarkable Irish woman, Sister Nivedita, of course, her life we keep for another day. But the second person must surely be Saint Brigid. There are 3 patron saints who are honored here in Ireland. Saint Patrick, of course, who you know, but Saint Brigid, who was made a Christian by Saint Patrick. And the other one is Saint Columcille. So these 3 are the great pillars of Irish spirituality. She not only joined a convent, but she was an abbess and she founded several convents throughout the country. And the most notable one was in Kildare. She was one of the most important, that was one of the most important monasteries in the whole of Ireland. There are only a few historical facts that we know about her life, but the fact that we know anything is testimony to her saintliness. As I say, she shares the name with the Celtic goddess, but she's patroness of many things, the same as the goddess, of poetry, of learning, of healing, of protection. And so as a result, many, many stories have grown up around her. She among the various stories, of course, she traveled the length and breadth of Ireland, spreading the message of Christianity without disturbing what was already there, but as I say, integrating everything. That's a great lesson to all of us. Among the most ancient accounts of Saint Brigid are 2 old Irish hymns. And the first one is by Saint Ultan of Ardbraccan, and that was, he died in 657. And so it's a testimony to her character, her personality, and her saintliness. And the second one is composed by Saint Brocken Clun, I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not sure. And it is all in Latin prose, of course. There were several subsequent Latin and Irish lives of the saints that were composed. And so she was not only a remarkable woman, a remarkable nun, a remarkable abbess, but she also had an ecclesiastical role leading the church in Ireland along with St. Patrick. According to tradition, she was born in just north of Dundalk. Those of you who know Ireland will know where that is, in County Louth. And as I say, there were a number of biographies, but there are 3 biographies that agree that her mother was Brocha, a Christian picked slave who had been baptized by St. Patrick. Her father was Dubtak, I think. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. No doubt somebody will correct me on that. But the fact that she was born in slavery, just like St. Patrick was also brought into slavery, is significant. You know, when we see these facts, we can always read into it something which is much more useful for us, because all of us, in a sense, are born into slavery. Even though we are free and don't know it, we feel that we are in bondage in some way. And what is the way out? First of all, Brigid found the way out by cultivating and expressing her pure love. And the love is always expressed through the hands in an action of compassion. So naturally, we see all her acts of generosity and love. But the second was her boldness, her defiance in the face of the possibility of retribution and punishment. That is a kind of strength. In spiritual life, we also require strength. So where are we now? First of all, we require resolve. Secondly, we require natural love. Thirdly, we require strength. And then ultimately, there was this renunciation. Now, there's a common mistake that we always advocate people should be monks and nuns. No, only a few people would want that life. But every life is sacred and can be lived in a sacred way. But she decided that's what she wanted to do. And so her life is, her biography of her life is a little uncertain, and yet we can still learn some lessons from it. As I mentioned before, her father was extremely annoyed by her generosity, and he took her in his chariot, to the king of Leinster, to sell her, actually. But when Dubtak was talking to the king, Brigid gave away his bejeweled sword to a beggar, where he could barter it for some food and so on. And as I mentioned, the result of that was the king gave her her freedom. So she came out of the bondage of slavery. What is the lesson for us? That despite all kinds of criticism, and despite the apparent impracticality of a generosity of spirit, we actually access our freedom through it. It is said that Brigid was veiled or received either this from Saint MacCall, who was the bishop of the time in County Offaly, or some say it was from Saint Mel. But in any event, it happened around about 468. And she and the Bishop Michael followed Saint Mel into the kingdom, another kingdom, which was made up of parts of the modern counties of Meath, Westmeath, and Longford. And those people who know the contemporary geography of Ireland will recognize these names. As I mentioned, she founded this monastery in Kildare, but she founded it on the site of a pre-Christian shrine to the Celtic goddess Brigid. And that is significant, and that is where these two names also can tie in. She founded this, Kildare means a church of the oak, and the oak again is a sacred Celtic tree. The oak, just like the Indian reverence for the banyan tree, the oak or the peepal tree, the oak was considered a sacred tree. And it also shows the reverence that those pre-Christian people and subsequently Celtic Christianity had in a positive way for the whole of nature. Sin and guilt came in later, but the Celtic Christianity was full of a love of nature and a reverence for nature and attunement to it. And that is why we see all the holy wells dedicated in a Christian way, not damaged, not criticized, not railed against. She was served by a group of young women who tended an eternal flame. That, I think, is very interesting. Because the Zoroastrians also tend a sacred flame, which is eternal. They never allow it to go out. And that comes back to the Vedic ritualistic custom of lighting a sacred fire. The site was under a large oak tree. It was on a certain ridge. And she initially had a group of 7 companions. She is credited with organizing communal, consecrated religious life for women in Ireland long before anybody else. And she founded 2 monastic institutions, one for men and one for women. And she managed also to integrate these 2. She was invited by a certain hermit from Old Connell near Newbridge to help her in Kildare as pastor of them. In other words, she's taking up an ecclesiastical duty in an area or in an era before there was a regulation that in the Catholic Church there should be no women clergy, no women priests. It's often been said that she gave canonical jurisdiction to one Conleth, who is the Bishop of Kildare. And she was selected as the person to whom the church or the Christian community at the time gave that jurisdiction. She chose St. Conleth to govern the church along with herself, the 2 of them doing it together. And for centuries, Kildare was ruled by this double line of abbot bishops and of abbesses. The abbess of Kildare being regarded as superior general of all the monasteries in the whole of Ireland. That is truly remarkable. It's a history that has largely been lost. Her successors have always been accorded episcopal honor significantly, and she was a good speaker. And her oratory at Kildare became also a center of religion and learning and developed into a cathedral city. She's credited also with founding a school of art, and how like that is with Sister Nivedita. And that included also practical things such as metalwork and illumination. It is said that the original Book of Kells was really the Book of Kildare, which was ransacked and lost at some point. The Kildare Scriptorium apparently made this Book of Kildare, and it drew high praise from various quarters, but it disappeared during the Reformation. And nothing has ever been seen of it since. But we are told that every page was filled with gorgeous, illuminated and interlaced work, and the harmony of the colors left the impression that all this is the work of angelic and not human skill. How do we express our spirituality if not through art and culture, beauty that exhibits our true nature of blissful beauty and luminosity? She spent her time in Connacht as well and founded many churches in the Diocese of Elphin. And she is said to have visited Longford, Tipperary, Limerick, South Leinster. In other words, she traveled pretty much all over Ireland. Of course, she had a great friendship with the person who baptized her, that is St. Patrick himself. And it is noted in a paragraph in the book of Armagh in Latin, it is translated like this, that between St. Patrick and St. Brigid, the pillars of the Irish people, there was so great a friendship of charity that they had but one heart and one mind. Through him and through her, Christ performed many great works. And so that is very naturally why this remarkable saint is honored in Ireland, but not only that, but reminds us of the goddess. Now there's a tradition, a very valid and reasonable tradition. If somebody is tuned in to the divine, in this case, let us call it the Divine Mother. If somebody is fully tuned in to that, surely that nearness becomes oneness. And surely when we look at that person, we see the same Divine Mother. And so it is remarkably true and remarkably profound and deep to say that when we look at Saint Brigid, we are also looking at the goddess Brigid. Anyway, ultimately, she passed away and her remains were moved around quite a bit. She had a very devoted student, and the student to her teacher that when attended to when she was dying, she was so attached to Brigid that when she lay dying, her disciple Dalok Dak expressed the wish to die with her, and I think today is also her feast day as well. But Brigid replied, she said, I want to die on that same day as you, but she replied, no, you should die on the anniversary of my death. And so it happened that Brigid would have died in 520, where are we? 521, and or tradition really says she died in 525, but other evidence says that she died in 521, and her disciple 1 year later in 522. And so today is assigned as the feast for both of them, actually, even though one died 1 year later. What does that tell us as well? It tells us about the great, great attachment that a disciple may have for the teacher, and the merits of doing that, because it's an imitation. We have Swami Vivekananda, for example, at the age of about 19, having written in Bengali an introduction to the imitation of Christ. He held it dear. When he went on his wanderings through the length and breadth of India, he carried the Bhagavad Gita and the Imitation of Christ, these two books. Because we should take the ideal and try to imitate it as much as we possibly can, setting the ideal very high, knowing that maybe it's difficult to become identified with the ideal, but at least setting it and working progressively toward it. Some remarkable stories about miracles naturally come to us from these various quarters. And so I'll read out some of these registered miracles that took place. There are many of them, so I'll only do a few of them. Of course, she is celebrated for her great generosity, as I mentioned, to the poor. In her case, most of the miracles associated with her relate to things like healing and household tasks, usually attributed to women. Anyway, after Brigid promised God a life of chastity, her brothers were annoyed at the loss of a bride price. And when she was outside carrying a load past a group of poor people, some began to laugh at her, ridicule her. A man named Basin said to her, The beautiful eye which is in your head will be betrothed to a man through, though you like it or not. And in response, Brigid thrust her fingers in her eye and said, here is that beautiful eye for you. I deem it unlikely that anyone will ask you for a blind girl. Her brothers tried to save her and wash away the blood from her wound, but there was no water to be found. And Brigid said to them, put my staff about this sod in front of you. And after they did, a stream came forth from the ground. Then she said to Basine, soon your two eyes will burst in your head. And it happened as she said. And some of these miracles are a little macabre, but never mind. The fact is that these miracles will show us something of the legend that grew up around her saintliness. Anyway, she had a reputation as an expert dairy woman, as we know from slave times. However, and a brewer also, which delights people then and probably today. And she was reputed to turn water into beer. And so I don't know what message there is in that. Of course, Christ did the same thing with wine. The fact is, when we take these stories, we have to look beyond the myth and say, okay, in those days, of course, water was one thing and something else, another drink was another, but the capacity to transform something, some life-giving thing, into something with extra value, that would be the message. In one story, Brigid protected a woman from a nobleman who had entrusted a silver brooch to the woman for safekeeping, but then secretly had thrown it into the sea. He charged her with stealing it, knowing that he could take her as a slave if a judge ruled in his favor. The woman fled and sought refuge with Brigid's community. By chance, one of her fishermen hauled in a fish, which when cut open, proved to have swallowed the brooch. The nobleman freed the woman, confessed his sin, and bowed in submission to Brigid. And a similar story is also told of another saint, Saint Mungo. So the point is that all these various stories, we don't know if they're true, we don't know if they're not. We should never dismiss miraculous things, nor should we place undue emphasis on them. The fact of the person's life is there, but naturally many stories will go up, particularly as these great saints are associated with the pre-Christian divinities of Brigid and so on. The lessons, therefore, in this remarkable woman's life, I'll try to summarize. Firstly, the integration of traditions. Today, in this world today, people are keeping separate. This is called exclusivism. People are fighting over God and religion. Swami Vivekananda said, more blood has been shed in the name of God and religion than any other cause in the world. But somehow, in this country of Ireland, where traditions honored and continued honoring the sacredness of nature itself, it seemed quite natural that there should be an integration. When St. Patron came to Ireland and he was asked about the concept of the Trinity, even today, theologians are disputing the significance and the subtlety of this. And yet St. Patrick simply holds up an indigenous plant, the shamrock, that has one stem and 3 leaves, and says, it's just like this, you see. One thing, but 3 expressions. Can you not see that? By talking gently to people, by maintaining the fire which is there, and carrying on all the traditions of the pre-Celtic or the pre-Christian era, and integrating them to the extent that the Celtic people over some 200 years, it didn't happen instantly, it was over some 200 years, gradually came round to a more enriched, probably, way of thinking, but yet retaining the richness of their own culture, to the extent that something specialized called Celtic Christianity arose. And that would have dominated had it not been for certain events in Lindisfarne and other places. So we find also that she became a leader. We can all be leaders in our spiritual life when we access our own inherent strength and faith and assert ourselves and come back to our origin. And then we too will leave the most important and significant legacy, the legacy of our own true nature. And it's still remarkable when I look at this Celtic cross, how it's constructed. It's a most peculiar thing, and yet so beautifully woven. I'll present it to you again. You can see the inside of it, you see? How it is beautifully woven. And how it is offset. It's not a vertical and horizontal figure. And you very clearly see the significance of this with its ancient origins as a devotion of the significance of seasons and the sun, carrying forth, even from Neolithic times, the whole sanctity of a sun that, after all, has all the same qualities of the divinity that we give. It is no accident that we worship the sun. It's not the sun itself, it's that which lights the sun. But let's examine. The sun has a beauty. The sun has a luminosity. The sun is a happy greeter in the morning. There is no more beautiful scene than a rising or setting sun. The sun is our friend. It travels across the sky, as it were, as if it were in a chariot. It blesses us with life. It is a life giver. We're all running around on borrowed sunshine. We don't have any energy of our own. We don't think about it. We don't spend any time thinking about the wonder of photosynthesis, of how the sun's energy gets caught by a leaf and by a very complex process that you and I cannot do, creates the carbohydrates necessary for our own energy. When the sun dies, we die with it. The relationship between the sun and the earth, the impersonal aspect of the sun, whereby even if we foolishly blow the entire earth up, the sun will continue shining. There was a poem that I wrote that encapsulates the life of Brigid, and it's worthwhile just reading it out, if I can catch it here. Having told you a little bit of her life, you'll understand the events that are portrayed in here. Born from slaves, free destiny, she offered hearts so willingly that the poor did well avail, calling her their Muir She is called the Mary of Ireland, or the Mother of Ireland. We call Sister Nivedita Logamata, the Mother of the World. That is picking up the clue from Rabindranath Tagore. That's what he called her. Of course, he was referring specifically to India. But it's remarkable the parallel we have between Sister Nivedita and Brigid in this regard. Let's just examine that statement. She was born a slave, born from slaves, free destiny. We are all born as apparent slaves, feeling a bondage that is not really there. We also have the freedom to release ourselves. And then how you do it? You do it by offering your heart willingly. And you do it by having sympathy for God the poor, God the distressed, evoking compassion. And then she said, then it goes, precious Father's sword she gave, for from hunger poor man save. Wherever Brigid's tokens travel, woven cross resolves the quarrel. Wherever you take this cross, it resolves it. You hang it over your door to attract good fortune and protect yourself from fire as well, from the damage of fire. So wherever you weave your life, wherever you weave the elements of discord into something positive, you find there is protection. And whatever you give away, don't have any attachment to something, give it away freely. When you release something, something good flows in. That's the law of nature. What we do is we cling on to it. There's a kind of illustration I give. That is, if I'm holding on to some little thing like this, I can't accept the abundance of life. If I let it go, I'm free. My hand is free to accept everything, all the good things that are there to be offered. Abbey and Church in Kildare, as mother, she presided there. Not only there, but the whole of Ireland. Leading men and women both, inspiring spring from winter's sloth. Inspiring spring, just as the goddess inspires spring. That means rousing ourselves from our lethargy and moving forward for the good of the world, becoming a world mover. This world requires more world movers. We can only do that by accessing our own inherent strength. Saint Brigid's miracles and stories, regaled with accounts of glories, ignites hope in desperate times, raising spirits, hearts, and minds. Are these desperate times? Many people think so, but there have been more desperate times in the past. How do we overcome any of these things? We recount the lives and the glories of these great personalities and saints, and we try to emulate their example and absorb their life and their breath in us. And by doing that, we raise other people's spirits. What good is it to sit and commiserate over the so-called vicissitudes of life? We have the capacity to turn our minds to something more positive, much more fruitful, much more beautiful. And so I conclude this with a prayer that accompanied this thought. O Lord, thy miracles and wonders are everywhere, but I am blind to them, caught up as I am in my selfish cocoon. Many want thy rewards, but few want to bear even a small cross. Many want to join the feast, but few want to share the fast. Grant that I may be with thee, and thee with me, pleased with each other's company, through every joy and vicissitude. And with that, I wish you again a very happy Brigid's Day and Imbolc, that is the start of spring. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Shekan, Shekan, Shekan. Thank you.